I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked, a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options to move on. And if you're serious about your career, this show is for you. And it doesn't matter whether you're a formal leader or not, because you are always the leader of yourself. Now, if you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, I encourage you to post your questions or comments. We're going to be monitoring those throughout the show and occasionally bringing in certainly if you bring a question, post a question, we're going to respond to that. So welcome there. Our topic today is diversity and inclusion. Now, those are words that carry many stories in this country, the US, and around the world. I began working in this arena in the 1970s, looking at diversity from the perspective first of gender. One of my sociological studies included the subtle aspects within written performance evaluations. My early findings became the guidebook for women to better describe the work they had done and accomplished so that their achievements were seen instead of being ignored or glossed over. The lesson is to talk about the results of your work, not just a description of the tasks that were done. I'm sure today that sounds obvious, but it wasn't then. In the 1990s, I then expanded my diversity work to the international arena and had the honor and opportunity to look at the reasons why inclusion can be elusive, even in international organizations like the International Monetary Fund. And although I did landmark work, that was many years ago. And so I am very much looking forward to hearing from our guest about diversity and inclusion today, and from a different part of the world that has experienced and dealt with this at deep levels. And speaking of diversity and inclusion, I am delighted to welcome back Ed Hoffman as my co-host. So Ed, I'm so glad you're with us today.
Madeline, it's always a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. And of course, our guest today is Tanya Cruz Teller. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Tanya. She has over 20 years international organization development experience. Tanya has worked for and with governments, global nonprofit organizations, and businesses to create a more equitable society through maximizing inclusion, innovation, and inspired action. They do tend to go together. She co-authored Thriving Women, Thriving World, an invitation to dialogue, healing, and inspired action in 2019. And in 2020, she contributed to the book Inclusive Leadership, Transforming Diverse Lives, Organizations, and Societies. Tanya, welcome to Unlocked.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you, Madeline and Ed. It's just a great day to be talking about these really important topics and unlocking the gifts in them all. Thank you.
I love that you brought in the name of the show. Thanks so much. Well, Tanya, I have to begin with asking you to really talk a little bit about your work and how you got to this amazing area of work.
Great, wonderful. Well, first, let me just say hello to everyone. My pronouns also, I like to share them, are she, her, hers. And I greet you currently from the land of the Anacostan people. I'm normally in the land of the Sand people, but work brought me here. So I'm very excited to be on this continent right now and in this space. And I love when I'm asked what brought me to this work, because I feel like the biggest gifts in this work is when we can bring our whole selves. And my journey to doing this work has really been a personal one. So just quickly, you can see from my name that it's a bit of a mixed masala. So I'll give you, without having to do the DNA test, I'll give you the journey. So I have ancestors who've come from the Philippines, both indigenous Filipino, as well as Chinese by trade and Spaniard by colonization, and devout Catholics. So that's my one side. And my other side is Eastern European heritage, Jewish, first generation USer. But I myself grew up in a third culture, as the UN calls it. So that's in Guatemala. So as you can see, a lot of my early part of my journey was really understanding how I bring these diverse and often conflicting, like devout Catholic, Jewish, different languages, into a sense of wholeness for myself. So often when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we bring in two other keywords, which is equity and belonging. And so for myself, the sense of belonging to different cultures and families and spaces, and how do I understand what's equitable depending on where I am in the world, was both my upbringing and my personal journey that then landed me into an international master's program that really focused on confirming a lot of my personal journey through professional models and intercultural processes, and how to work in organizational development. And so all my work then landed me into South Africa, where I was recruited by the South African government. And that took me into a whole nother sphere of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, because as a woman of color, that was my identity and my experience in the world, bridging those. And then I came to a country where it was so binary in terms of its Black and white history. And so because of my accent, I was automatically categorized as white and had access to white privilege. And so it became this whole other journey of how can I be in service to ways that we're perceived, ways that we show up, ways that we can support organizations in South Africa and beyond to have everyone bring their whole selves and strengthen the cultures where they can innovate and where they can share their best ideas, where they can be vulnerable, make mistakes, and come up with the best solutions that this time is really asking us to do. So that's my journey into this space and this work.
What a path.
Yeah.
Ed, have you ever heard a path like that?
It's it brings a lot of diversity present. It actually made me think while you were talking, Tanya, in improvisation. One of the quotes that I'd heard is, when you're handed a line, you accept it. And I always took that to mean that when you're given something, you don't push back, you respond to it, you adapt. And so it makes me anticipate that you're probably good at creativity, adaptation, and seeing things from different perspectives. And I wonder if you feel that the journeys you've had, the different backgrounds has actually helped you that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only do you accept it, I think part of the choice points that we have in this work and in this day and age is, can we find the gift in what this moment is calling for, and both the shortcomings so that we can absolutely unpack what the possibilities are. So you can't innovate if you're like in fear trigger, right? And so I think the improv people really know how to manage their like, oh, what's next, the unknown, by staying really present with that line that they're given and with what's possible.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot, because I think it requires, not to overstate it, but it requires courage. Just like if you get on stage, you're talking to someone. Once it's not scripted, then there's a little bit of fear. And I think coming from different perspectives, it opens up, I think, more opportunities, more possibilities, but also the courage to do things and to talk things in different ways. So.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tanya.
Well, I'm just really struck by, when there's a generative metaphor, what it gives us. So if we continue along this thread, in diversity and inclusion work, so much of what people are up against is fear of the unknown, fear of making mistakes, right? Fear of cultures and other identities that we don't know, or we've been taught are wrong or bad, or we've had no exposure. And what are those things that shore us up to be courageous in the unknown? is really the call to this time, to feel strong enough in one's identity and in one's ability to create positive change, to then hold that courage in the unknown. So thank you for naming the courage that it takes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also want to pick up on your comment that you have to know who you are. That's really one of the first steps in building resilience and nurturing your resilience, is to get inside yourself and say, who is this amazing thing that even though when I'm hit with something, I know I can stand because this is who I am. So it's great that these are all coming together. I'm also curious, in this kind of work, I know, now, of course, my work in this particular area was 20 years ago. Has it changed? And that's what I'm curious about. So what are the challenges that you're currently hitting when you work with people and to help them understand that this is something, that diversity and bringing everyone into the conversation is really valuable?
Well, thankfully, we're having this conversation now versus maybe 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. When I was trying to have these conversations, it was very much about, well, what's the business case? Thankfully now, and perhaps the silver lining of COVID is that we've had to innovate so much, and we've had to get so creative in organizations. And I know in the US, there's a great resignation, as you all are calling it. You know, in South Africa, of course, jobs are really vital and important and in need. And so organizations have all been figuring out, well, how do we retain, how do we adapt? So how do we innovate? And that has created the gift of, there is no way that one leader knows everything, right? And in fact, the more you can involve all the people that you've hired, all the people that you've entrusted in some way, even the community, your clients, your stakeholders, to be a piece of the solution and the whole, the better we are. And so done is this business case of why DEI. I think that we're really seeing that. And I think those who are still asking that, unfortunately, I think have a very limited success rate or time frame in their business or their organization succeeding. So let's focus on those who understand COVID, understand innovation, and understand that things are moving so fast and so quickly that the more brains and hearts that you have on the problem, on the challenge, the better you can adapt, and the more people you can bring along with you, which is really what we're looking for in succeeding. And that's just, let's say, the business case. Of course, we also have a social and moral imperative. But what I'm loving is that I think a lot more people understand the social and moral imperative, right? How do we create a whole world? Like, can there be enough space for all if I'm not fearful? Like, is there enough to share? How do we take care of the planet so that we have next generations to come? But now coming alongside that is, as organizations, we really need to think completely out of the box to navigate this time.
Did you have a comment that you wanted to make?
Yeah, I mean, I was, so one of the things, I see a lot of things, we all tell stories about each other. And so the story that I hear when you talk about your different backgrounds is someone who uses that to your advantage to see possibilities in innovation, to be able to listen to different languages, if you will. And I notice that you somewhat introduce yourself as an organization development person. That was my background. And at the core of OD, I always saw it as it's about promoting ethical and good change. And I wonder if you could talk about how diversity and equity and inclusion really lead to these kind of societal and organizational improvements. I don't think it's a numbers thing. I think sometimes people think, oh, it's a numbers thing, make sure everyone is in the room. But it's really about leading to the kind of changes that we want, right, in our teams and organizations and society. So the OD transformation part is what I wonder how this connects for you in the work that you've pursued.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. I think that really gets to the why OD for me. So my first name, I was named after Tanya, who was a Cuban revolutionary who actually, she was an insider outsider. So I think my parents knew that they were gifting me this. She was Russian descent. And so I come from these roots of mobilizing people for good, right? Or that's what I think I was gifted. But where there were so many different places. I explored psychology. I thought, okay, I'm really good at listening and maybe coaching and guiding. But when I got to work with organizations and get to choose to be a part of an organization, I realized that, wow, this ecosystem is the ecosystem that I want to work in, more than community organizing, more than in government in particular ways. It was more agile. It was a group of people coming together with shared values, with a culture that could be co-created, with leadership that could make choices around how they wanted to lead and prioritize people and their purpose. And I thought, okay, this is where the transformation I want to see in the world, these are the hotbeds of where it's possible, right? So in South Africa, a lot of times you might stay in your race or ethnic group, right? But then you go to work. And then here you're working as peers in a very different way, or with a boss who's of a different racial group than you, or exposed to perhaps the tea lady who's of a different race or class than you. And you get to really understand how do we create this ecosystem and this culture where we can all achieve like our greatest good and our purpose. And I know that Esther Perel, who's a relationship guru that maybe a lot of people know about, has been talking about like, wow, so she doesn't just help people in their relationships at home, because she helps people at work now, because we're coming to work with all these needs, all these passion, all these relationships. And so if we can, in this ecosystem, create processes, principles, values, ways of working with each other that are transformative, we bring them into our homes, we bring them into our communities. We're completely transformed in a way that doesn't necessarily happen in our community or other spaces that we're able to do in organizations. So that's why I chose this incredible ecosystem, which is now in the last couple years, especially with the George Floyd murder and other big awarenesses, you see organizations making statements that they never used to about the larger community and ecosystem. So now organizations even more can make choices and can impact the kind of world that we want to see for all.
You know, one of the things that I love about what you're saying is you're bringing the corporate world, the organizational entities, into ordinary life. That's something that I've always worked with people. They historically, they have sort of stepped into the business and set aside their children, their spouse, their personal life, and so that they had to stay very funnel perspective on the business. And you're right. I think that when through COVID or whatever it was that woke us up, we're now living more blended lives. And the fact that we can change things in one arena is reflected in another.
Yeah. And I think, Madeline, you and Ed can probably speak to, like you've both led purposeful workspace lives, right? And so if you find purpose in your work, what then do you want to transform in that workspace that will ripple into your families and into your communities?
Well, I'm going to answer first, and Ed, I'll toss it to you. For me, the big thing is values. A lot of people over the years have asked me to talk about the work-life balance, and I just tell them there is no such thing. You have to have work-life integration. Now, how do you integrate those two things? And you integrate them through values, so that when you're making a decision in one arena or another arena, you have to remain consistent with the values that you have. And as long as you can say that, then it works. So that's sort of my response to you.
Yeah, I love that integration, right? They're not buckets, right?
That's the key. There's so many keys, right, to life and to work. But when years ago, when I was at NASA, I had a person, young woman, just working at NASA for like 2 or 3 weeks. And she said, "How are you successful over here?" And I immediately interpreted it as a traditional human resource question. I said, "Well, it was training, it's career development." No, no, no. She says, "I know that." She says, "Let me explain. I see people who are very happy. They've been here for 20 years and they're happy and they're engaged and they almost sing when they're at work. And I see other people who are smart, but they don't seem to be happy to the same degree. How do you?" And I think that gets to what we're talking about, which is purpose. The sense that what you're doing is important, that it's contributing to society. I love the term you used earlier, mobilizing people for good, because I think most people want to feel they're a part of that. So I think that purpose is good. In addition to values, which I think is very important, I think you have to get comfortable having fun and being curious. And you talked about your name, Tanya, being partly revolutionary, and there's a funness, I think, to that maybe you have, and I would follow that up with when you work with people in groups, how do you help people get that sense of purpose, whether it's values or that revolutionary spirit of being alive? Because it's hard, right? It's not difficult. It's not easy to do.
I think there's a perception that it's hard when we come at it in traditional ways,
Yeah.
right? So, so here's what's my go-to. If you can ask people to tell their stories from moments of strength and moments of resilience, people come alive in a way that is incredible, because depending on where you're at in the world and your work and your sense of ego or identity, is that oftentimes in workspaces, there's always somebody who knows more than you, right? It's the academic, or the book that I haven't read yet, or that podcast, or, or my boss, or the chairperson, or the board, or the community member, whatever your sphere is. There's always someone else. And so what that does is that inhibits our ability to come alive in a particular way, to center what we have to bring in to give. So when we ask generative questions that say, tell me a peak moment, or when you were in a culture where you really felt you were included, or when we do gender inclusion work, right? Tell me a moment when you were in cross-gender working partnership where you really felt safe, or you really felt seen or heard. Like, tell me about it. Tell me that story. And people telling stories of themselves from not places of brokenness, from not places of less than, it is a complete game changer. Mm-hmm. And especially in the work of diversity and inclusion, there's a lot of pain, and there's ancestral pain and trauma. And so we want to honor that. And we want to invite and build a muscle that says, well, actually, what is it that you have to bring that's a strength? What if you looked at intersectionality as giving you gifts, right, of having multiple identities, not just the layers of oppression? So we want to hold the both and. And so when people start telling stories, they come alive, because they have a renewed, in my appreciative leadership Lotus model, we talk about one of the steps being renew your relationship to self, right? And so we can do that through storytelling, even in tough moments that share our strengths and our resilience. And then when people feel connected to themselves in a strength-based way, I can better listen to you, Ed. Like, I'm not trying to see if you're doing power over me or you're not hearing me. And so when we're in relationship, that's who we are as humans. Like, we want to be in positive, healthy relationships with each other. And so when you and I have listened to each other's stories in this way, and you're the expert in your story and I'm the expert in mine, nobody can say it differently. We can then be invited into dreaming together, into visioning together. And that's really the work that we do. So how do we get people into their strengths? And then how do we get them to create vision statements, visions of their cultures that are inclusive, that are equitable, And we do that in playful ways. So whether it's enactment or poetry, and you'd really be surprised. You have people who are keen, and then you are people who are introverts and who are like, I'd rather die doing this in the workplace, right? And what you then do, which is really important, is you name it. Like, it's always naming like our vulnerabilities and our resistance points, and saying, well, if we're needing to step into the unknown, like the unknown comes with so much resistance and comes with fear. Like, can we notice that, and can we use this as a practice space that's relatively safe to actually perhaps create an enactment or a skit, or a drawing, right? We oftentimes have we brought together this company, is a mining company that had been through huge, painful, murderous negotiations, right? That then, once it was passed, that said, you know what, we know that the unions actually want to create a right culture for their workers. And so do we as management. Can we come together, not across the bargaining table? And how can we do that to create a shared vision, or to start rebuilding relationships and create a shared vision? And so that's what we did. We had them interview each other across unions, across management positions. We had them then create these drawings where everybody had to draw. Like, what might it look like to be in a culture where everyone is valued and can bring themselves? And then to see it and then to co-own it, there was incredible shift and movement that's possible when you can get people to stand in their strengths, connect to each other, activate a different part of their brain altogether.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact. I love the fact that you began with story, that they had to tell their own story, because when we tell our own story, we almost go to that place, that moment, that event, and so the environment around us becomes less important to us. Because we're in that former space, and we can see things. You're right. I think you see things about your strengths, your weak, anything, all kinds of things that you just simply don't focus on, but it comes out through the story. Yeah. And I know you have experience with this, even at NASA.
Yeah, no, I was looking because, as Madeline knows, I've just moved. So I don't have my books, but I have prime ones. And first one I co-authored with my colleague Alex Laffer was Success Stories in Projects. And just the other day, I was talking to an organization, how do you get started changing? And I say, you have to start sharing the stories. And in my recommendation, start with successful ones. You don't start with all the problems and all the conflict and all the issues. We can get there, but start with examples of when we've been successful together. Build that confidence. I also loved, Tanya, when you started with, it's looking at the stories and figuring out how to grow from that. And Madeline's heard me say this. I think what has helped NASA change over the decades is really a good use of reframing stories as time goes by. Most powerful tool of all the things that I think are there. So I very much connect with that. You know.
Definitely. Yeah. Another thing that you said early on, Tanya, and then you've had so much to say, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you talked about bringing our hearts into the work. And when you said that, I thought about the power of our intentions. You know, we often forget that words come out of our mouth, but it's really our intentions that people are perceiving. Teachers can affect their students by their intentions. Parents can affect their children by their intentions. And I just wonder if you could give an example from your experience of where you saw those intentions really activate new things.
Yeah. Wow. Madeline, I'm so glad you bring that up. It gives me the opportunity to share that the OD work that we do in particular is with appreciative inquiry, and it's positive psychology and strength-based. And one of the research foundations of it really has to do, even coming from the medical field, of both in education and in medicine, which is the impact of the teacher or the impact of the instrument of change on those that you're changing, right? So we know that if a doctor gives you a placebo, right, that we have out of 100, you have 70, 75 because they believe it, right? And then the really amazing additional factor is like, well, when the doctor themselves didn't know that it was a placebo and they thought it was a real, it bumped up another 25, 30%. I mean, how incredible is that, right? So the intention and the thought of the person who is hoping for positive change, it's really significantly impacts. And we hold that as our truth when we work with a group of people, that there is way more diversity than is visible, that there are so many stories of success, Ed, as you were saying, that we don't even know about, that we can get curious about, that we can invite people into, that both creates that oxytocin and the mirror neurons with each other, but it's also these excellent stories of what we need to learn from. And so people step in and people get called to that. So I'll share maybe another, I know you like stories. So we were working with a management, an economics consulting company. It's the largest one in Africa, based in South Africa. And they knew that they needed to address sexual harassment, right? Like it was just a ticking time bomb. We knew everywhere. So we said, okay, with a company, Mandate Molefi, that we partner with, said, okay, great. So we'll do those workshops. Absolutely. And we know, and this is holding the intention, we know that people are also in really good, healthy relationships with each other, with clients. So what can we do an inquiry into where are those healthy relationships and what could we learn from those as well? And then we created case studies that could go into the sexual harassment workshop, but also just in itself, the ideas, the vision for what it looks like when you do have healthy cross-gender relationships was phenomenal. And that all started with us holding the intention and the assumption that there is assets in this moment and in this situation. And how can we also look at the assets so that we can help fix the deficits?
That's so powerful. To actually be able to see, observe the good, the healthy relationship, and to articulate that through story or inquiry, as you say, that's very exciting because I know I mentor a lot of young people, and one of the issues when you're young, in your 20s, 30s, is the aspect of sexuality between the sexes. And how do you work in that environment? What do you look for so that you protect yourself and yet are effective as a professional? So I love this, that you actually have defined or described rather these good relationships.
Yeah. I mean, some of them were really surprising where where it's not, it's not just internal, it's also with your clients, right? And what does it mean, for example, to be the female lead of the project and to walk into the room with the client with your male colleague who reports to you and have them completely assume that they're the lead and completely send all the questions to them.
Still.
Yeah. Right. It's incredibly relevant. And so the questions that we asked were both to really unpack, because everybody matters in this situation, right? So for the female boss, like what would you have liked in that situation? Like what has you standing in your power around it? To the male colleague, who was like, well, I know we say client is number one, client is always right. Do I have the company's authority to actually correct, the client and to be a male ally? And so we have people go into stories that are really vulnerable where people can say, I don't know, or I wanted this, or I didn't do that, or I didn't do it right. And what would be even better if, next time?
I'm wondering about, you obviously lead from a standpoint of positivity and win-win and growth. And you've mentioned appreciative inquiry is one of the core tools that you use. I wonder if for the audience, at a basic level, what is appreciative inquiry and how can it be used by a team?
Yeah, great. So I'll say there's a bit of a misnomer where people think appreciative means positive. And so maybe we can unpack that a little bit. So appreciate, if you think like your bank account appreciates, right? It goes up. It is a great way to think about it as well. And inquiry is a looking into and a seeking. And so the field of practice is really saying that the questions that we ask are fateful, right? It's whatever we ask into an organizational system will bring us more of what we want. So think about it as, so we call it the simultaneity principle, right? So if you have a thermometer and you want to measure the water, right? What's the temperature of the water? And you put it into your glass. The mere fact that that thermometer went into that glass actually changes the temperature of it. So it's the same in organizations. It's the same with leadership. It's the same in our lives. So the questions that we ask matter. Sure, we need to know what's wrong, but we also need to know, what do we want and what's working, as you were saying, Ed, and those stories. So appreciative inquiry then asks us to be very clear about what's our topic of inquiry, right? So with this example that I gave of this organization, are you inquiring into sexual harassment? Or are you inquiring into, like, what do you actually want? What's your positive topic, right? What's the most generative topic that you want? Well, we want to reduce sexual harassment, right? So we want to reduce it, but what do you ultimately want? We want people to be in healthy cross-gender relationships with each other, where everyone is valued, everyone is safe, and that's how people work with each other. Great. So if that's what we really want, then we do an inquiry into it. Then we ask those questions. And of course, what will come up, this is where it's really important. It's not just all about the positive. Of course, what will come up is all the obstacles to it, all the challenges to it. And then in those challenges, and say, okay, so if those are the challenges, how do we understand it better by what would we want instead of that? Right? So turning the problem into an opportunity and then creating some solutions, both through storytelling, through prototyping, through research, through action research. So Ed, did I say enough to define it? I always like to, I know I'm very circular in my cultural way of explaining.
Yeah, I think it's an important concept. I like the notion that it's not just a positive. It's not making believe that there aren't challenges, issues, or problems out there. It's an appreciation for the inquiry and the conversation, the exploration. And, the best teams, again, this is what I saw at NASA, the most successful teams, they would face any challenge with a reality or with a total commitment that we're the ones here to handle this. And that to me is what I'm hearing, and that I think is so powerful. We want to be a part of a team. We want to be really a part of a community that can take on anything and do it well and effectively and collaboratively.
Yeah. It reminds me of if not us, then who?
Then who? That's right. Because we're the party in the room, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about young people. They are not running an OD session. They've maybe just joined. They're early in their career, but they're serious. How can they take the concepts you've been talking about, Tanya, so they can apply them to themselves and their work?
Mm-hmm. Great. So maybe we can start with the lens of belonging, right?
Okay.
So
sure. Important one.
So the question would be for this young person, which is what enables me to bring all my best ideas? What enables me? So I could ask myself these questions, right? It's wonderful to be in inquiry with oneself, right? So, when I've been able to bring my best ideas, What were those conditions? How did I feel? Who else was involved in this moment? And then how can I create that more in my workspace, right? How can I, so that's one. Another question might be, when I have had to come back from setbacks, right? Especially when we're young in our career, right? We might have doubts. Perhaps we don't have a lot of organizational or positional power or even social power yet. And so there'll be things we want to do or ideas we have, and they've been denied or declined. And then the question is like, well, how do I stay resilient and stay in the game, right? Like stay in the organization, stay a part of the team, stay able to contribute, be heard, be seen. And so the questions that you might want to ask yourself is, okay, well, what are moments in the past when I've had a setback and I've been able to not completely come down hard on myself, where then I'm more wounded, or we know what's happening inside us, with the neuroscience of like, okay, like if we're in big fear, we might be in flight, we might be in fawn, right? So none of those ways of really showing up our whole selves at work. And so if I can learn from some of those experiences, and if I don't have them, how can I get curious, right? Like, oh, I don't actually have any stories of being resilient in being shut down around my idea, or being resilient in things being declined. Like, who might I interview or ask or learn from that might be able to give me some of their tips and tricks that could help build that muscle for me, so that I can show up more whole, bring more of my ideas, and also navigate the learning journey, which we're all in our organizational lives.
I love the fact that you also suggested that they reach out, because oftentimes what I ask people to do is, if they can't think of that moment, ask someone that they trust. Tell me about a time when I did such and such. And it's amazing when you start asking other people their stories about you. It opens up things incredibly. Even though it's their story, because they're observing you, you can still see so much of yourself in that opportunity, especially if you've blocked it off from yourself, thinking you wouldn't possibly know that or be able to do that. Yeah.
It's a great way to get some feedback that helps, that sometimes we can't see, that really helps us. I
have a question that it always comes up when I'm working with groups or teams or my students, is the fear question. Because there are people who are having difficult times in life, and in many cases they're working where they don't want to be working for someone that they would never want to be working with. And it's easy for me to say, well, explore, go in a different direction. But they're afraid, right? They're afraid of leaving what they have and going into a new territory. How do you advise a person who's afraid of they recognize the need to change, they want to change, but the environment is not safe enough or comfortable enough or to allow that? How do you deal with the fear? And I know there's not a great answer for that. That's the one thing that I always get asked, that I'm not in their shoes, so it's how do you address that?
Yeah, well, Ed, that's a huge question with a lot of different variables. So maybe can we narrow down the variable that that this person is financially okay enough to leave? I mean, I just want to, because we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that there's a lot of factors for people. So let's say that it's a psychological blockage, right? That doesn't enable them to see that. So again, we turn to a lot of storytelling here, right? So can you look in your environment for people who have taken a risk and in this way, and what did they, how are they successful, right? So the more, and a lot of times we don't have those role models in our families. Like, we might be the first, to go to college, depending on who you are, so I just really want to be incredibly inclusive in this. And so it might be that we seek stories that can give us a perspective on it. And then to have a person that you can sit with, where you can actually say your fears. And normally we tell people, and this is where people are like, oh, appreciative and great, or, strength-based, you can't bring any of your fears. No, actually, the idea is to feel them. Like, feel all your feels, like all emotions welcome. As one of our organizational colleagues likes to say that, all emotions welcome. So if you feel that, right, and then you notice, okay, I feel fear, and this is what I want. What is it that might be stronger than my fear that I could be called towards? Is there a generative metaphor? So people's stories, generative metaphors that help people have a touchstone for that courage, in that moment, are often the ways in which we help people overcome their fear of that unknown and step into their courage. Yeah.
I like that answer. I really do. To ask, yeah. I'm not even going to try to phrase it. It's really nicely done, because Ed, your question is so quintessential.
Yeah.
Fear is what holds us back in so many areas.
Yeah.
And I often think of students who I say, well, go call that economist. Oh, well, he wouldn't want to talk to me. Oh,
Right.
yes, he would. So, yeah.
People love to talk to other people. And, I think what I'm hearing you say, Tanya, is there are steps that you can take in many situations to get started. Talk to someone, understand the options. So often we get opportunities because we talk to people, and they talk to people, and a connection happens that leads to a path. But the key, I think, you can't just, you don't change by staying, right? And so there's these aspects, but it's a key issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder if you could ask them if it doesn't have to be sometimes our lessons are not in the same spaces in which we're finding that obstacle. Right. So sometimes it's asking the question, like, can you remember a time where you had to do something that was incredibly scary in your family? In applying for a loan or a credit card or something like that. And so having them come back to their own sense and what it does to us emotionally to strengthen us before moving into then, like, okay, in this really scary situation, what of that can you bring with you and apply? Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, I can't believe that we are almost finished our time.
And I got 5 more questions for Tanya.
And I have a generative metaphor I want to share with you all.
Okay, well, I'm going to definitely give you time, Tanya, to do that. And Ed, if this is a short question, go ahead.
I don't know if it's a short question. I hear you're someone who learns. You're on top of things. That's, so you can position yourself. How do you go about learning for yourself?
Wow.
Yeah, I don't think it's
not
a
short question, Ed.
Well,
sorry.
Well, it's so interesting because I do know that, like, I have particular gifts and I'm really incredible at certain things, right? So I'm like, I have a zest for life, right? And so I'm ever curious.
Sure.
And so I get that not everybody's like that, right? I get to work with a lot of people like that, and that's okay. I usually invite people to remember moments when they were curious and they had zest, right? And to find something that they are curious about so that they can see the learning process and the learning journey, and then be able to apply that into whatever the space is, that they're looking for. And sometimes it's just saying, like, you're either curious or you're dead. Like, you're learning or you're done.
Or you're dead.
You can't be in this VUCA world and not make a choice to be in relationship to the ever-changing nature in a way that you're not a victim, but you are making choices as much as possible around your learning. So you can't choose a lot of things in this VUCA world, I have to say, right? Like who our leaders are, I mean, I vote and all that, but it's like, well, what do I have a choice about? Like, how can I learn in this moment? What's the gift? How can I get more creative? How can I bring more people along? How can I understand what's painting that person that they can't see me, or they can't see my identities, and how can I keep coming home to myself?
Okay. Well, speaking of coming home to ourselves, great question, Ed. Good response, Tanya.
I feel zestful. That's all I'm going to say.
Very definitely. Very definitely. Well,
Yeah.
this has been a marvelous conversation, Tanya. I knew when I invited you it was going to be wonderful. And I knew that if Ed could join in, it would even be better. And I think that's the case. And some of the things that I take out of this is this, the aspect of constantly looking at what enables you. Discover those stories about what enables you, and that our hearts are really important in this all this work. I think, though, that I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I would rather pass the baton to you, Tanya, to see if you have any closing comments that you want to make. And Ed, I'll come back to you too.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would say to tell those stories in relationship to others. Like for us, we're guided by Ubuntu. I am because you are, right? So of course it's my own story, but it's my story with you, and it's how we invite each other to listen, actively listen with each other, that then we can create new possibilities. And so I think I mentioned the Appreciative Leadership Lotus model that was published in the Inclusive Leadership book. Finding a generative metaphor like the lotus has been game-changing for us. So for example, like a lotus can only grow in mud. So my relationship to mud, right? What's happening in the world right now, to know and to trust this intention that you're talking about, Madeline, that there's nutrients in this muddy, mucky situation that we're in now that we can grow and blossom into is what I hold near and dear for myself and for everyone who's in this work and in this journey. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Tanya. Ed, do you have any final comments you would like to say?
Yeah, it really goes back to the beginning of Tanya is, embrace revolutionary for the good of people. Because I remember you talking about your name and your ancestry and revolutionary, and you have that smile. And I think that's important, that we should be able to be comfortable doing revolutionary things for ourselves and for others that are for good. So that's what I walk away with at this point.
Wonderful. Well, Tanya and Ed, I'm going to take you off screen, but I'm going to ask you to stay in the studio so we can have a quick confab after the show, and I'll be right back with you.
Thanks to everyone. Thank you.
Well, I don't know about you, but I have found this conversation to be really amazing. It went in directions I didn't anticipate, which I think is absolutely wonderful because that's where it was supposed to go. So if you have a comment about something that you heard or that you learned that you might do differently as a result, make a comment in social media. And if you've been watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, click the like button and make a comment there too. As always, send me ideas of what you would like to hear more about. Just write to me at madeline@madelineblair.com. It's down there on the screen. What would be helpful to hear about? Maybe it's how to use more humor or how to write a great LinkedIn profile. Whatever it is, let me know. And if I use your topic, you'll receive a copy of my book, Essays in Two Voices, that is being used across 4 continents. Remember that the archives of all of our shows are at www.madelineblair.com/media. You just scroll down and get some inspiration. And please check out my book, Unlocked, on Amazon. Now, for next week, we'll be in conversation with Laura Humphrey, who will be joining us from London. She'll be talking about 10 principles for navigating the next normal. Put Laura Humphrey on your calendar and join us on June 22 at noon Eastern here on Unlocked, on E360 TV or live on my YouTube channel, Madeline Blair, or my profile on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining this segment of Unlocked. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.